feel like on TV. Oh, Ulrike is there.
Hello, everybody. Let me open the next panel on how to apply expertise from big pharma to small biotech or medtech. Let me welcome Eric Rambeaux from France. More than 25 years of experience in the healthcare industry, in medical devices, in drug companies, but also in consulting space. In his industry life, he has been serving in organizations such as Baxter, Merck, KGaA, and Solvay Pharma. He has been leading commercial development efforts for numerous products in various therapeutic areas, including urology, dialysis, diabetes, and lipid disorders. He was instrumental in the success of numerous corporate strategic projects, such as major acquisitions, and as well as design and implementation of new organizations and processes. Over to you, Eric.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Peter, and good morning or good afternoon, everyone, and good morning for the folks who are in the US. Thank you very much for the invitation to lead, which I understand is the last panel discussion of the meeting. So I hope everybody is still there and has a little bit of courage to follow the next couple of minutes together. Basically, as this is the last meeting, and I think that most of the panelists you have seen already, if the panelists agree, I would like to break the rules and maybe let them introduce themselves in a couple of sentences instead of reading short bios that you have probably heard already. So if you guys agree, maybe you can say a couple of words about yourself, and then we go straight into the discussion. Paul, you are
happy to do that. So my career has taken me from GSK to AstraZeneca to Novartis, and then I took the opportunity a couple of years ago to work to move from big pharma to a smaller company. So moved from an organization of 100,000 to an organization of about 300 people. So yeah, really looking forward to this discussion today.
Ulrike? Ulrike, can you hear me? So maybe Kyle, you can.
Happy to.
Yes, thank you. I also worked in big pharma and smaller pharma like Merck, KGaA.
We have difficulties.
And Fresenius BIOTECH, I think there is a kind of echo in at least how I hear it, sorry. And also worked at Vifor Pharma in Switzerland. And since 2019, I work as an independent consultant with focus on project, portfolio, and alliance management.
Kyle?
Excellent. I'm the MedTech representative in the group. I have 20 plus years in med device, both large companies and small, and I'm happy to bring maybe a different perspective here, but also to really be the recipient of some of these big pharma applications and practices, and we'll see whether we're different or not. Okay. Looking forward to it.
Okay, thank you very much, all of you. Just before I ask the first question to the panel, I really would like to encourage the floor to ask questions through the chat. I think that the panel is here for you and answer your questions, so don't be shy, especially through the chat. Feel free to ask questions. I guess that would contribute to the discussion. But anyway, before you guys start asking questions, I would like to start with the first one, which is kind of basic. Obviously, big pharmas and small companies are quite different, and they manage portfolio and project management in a different way. So based on your experience, what are the fundamental differences that you see between product and portfolio management in small or big pharma, or in small or big companies? And concretely, how do these differences translate into the activities which are actually performed by the staff?
Paul, I'm wondering if you start us off.
Yeah, thanks for volunteering me. Yeah, I guess, if I think about, fundamental differences, I mean, the thing that jumped out most for me when I moved was, big pharma is, and I'm from a development background, and, they're development machines, yeah? And I would say, they know what they're doing. They crank the handle and they turn out, great drugs, right? And that kind of whole process is very functionally centric, I would say. You've got functions know exactly what they need to be doing, and they are dealing simultaneously with multiple programs. So I would say big pharma are very functionally driven. When I moved to a smaller organization, one of the first things I noticed was small organizations seem much more willing to kind of chunk up those development programs, treat them as cross-functional exercises, and put a project manager in place to deal with those chunked up pieces of development work. I think that was one of the first things that I noted. Secondly, of course, big pharma has huge portfolio. In Novartis, we had 100 plus programs, tons and tons of organizational learning and know-how that you can draw upon when you're actually doing your project management work, your program management work. Moving to a smaller company, one or two assets, first time they've done it, doesn't exist. Yeah, so that it's an upside down set. It gives you the flexibility to do it kind of how you want to do it, but you don't have that kind of weight of organizational learning behind you to help you do it. Those were the first kind of two things that I noted when I made it.
I'll jump in and say that, Paul, I've had the experience of portfolio sizes that are in between those. So somewhere in the 30 to 40 range of projects in a portfolio. And what I've noticed is that the portfolio reviews can tend to be difficult. And in the med device world where I've been, as a portfolio manager, it's been a little bit frustrating because my preference would be to have, during a typical portfolio review every 6 months, say, to have quite a bit of time to review projects in the portfolio. But I'll be curious to hear if this is a similar experience. But particularly for portfolio reviews, an inordinate amount of time was spent on a relatively few number of projects that comprise the portfolio. And it really kind of sucked time away from other projects that needed to be discussed. And it really kind of got away from what should have been a thorough and comprehensive review, and ended up turning into an emphasis on just a few.
Ulrike?
Yeah, to share my experience, I think, yes, thank you, Eric. The processes in big pharma are established really with clear roles and responsibilities. Many functions are involved, and that's why it takes a long time to come to decision making. So it's quite slow. Whereas in smaller companies or startup environment, it's not at all established. It's more hands-on. People, depending on their knowledge, do what is required to do. And this enables them to, even up to C-level, they participate in progressing the project, not just in decision-making. And so it's much faster. And also my observation is that the smaller companies take more risks. They accept more gaps and are more agile to find solutions.
And I mean, listening to you guys, I just wanted to re-insist on the second part of my question about skills required. In my experience, I've been working in big companies like Baxter or Merck, like 30,000 plus employees, and also leading a startup of 3 employees. So I mean, the difference is even bigger than you, Paul. But my perception was that in small companies, especially in startups, there is a need for every C-class member to be really project management driven, or at least project management savvy. While in big pharma, you've got people who have different type of skills. So, I mean, would you agree with this experience as well, where at the end of the day, I mean, the CTO of a startup has really to be a project manager, and even the CEO to a certain extent has to be a project manager?
I would certainly agree with it. if I think back to, the structure that we had in place at Novartis, so you'd have the role I was global program head, I'd be supported by a global program manager, and then a back office as well of guys who were doing the finances and all of that kind of stuff. It was really a pampered type of position, and then moving to a smaller company, absolutely, it's just more hands-on. There's an expectation that, even if you're in a leadership role, that you also take, one of those programs to run yourself. And actually, I personally think that's actually a good thing. It stops you being too divorced as well from the day-to-day, development activities of the program. So I actually don't think that's a bad thing.
I'd agree. My experience has been the smaller the company, the more hats you wear, right? And to Ulrike's point, the more risk you take on.
Yeah, and the good news is that taking on those risks, I think, in my experience, is really rewarded, because if you have good arguments towards authorities, they also tend to help you, being smaller companies. So it's really rewarded, and I would always encourage to take a certain risk. Of course, you need rationale, you need to show that you are diligent and try everything. But it's better to try and go than to be perfect, which I experienced also in my bigger pharma company experience. And that were endless rehearsals and really, very detailed discussions. And I mean, we were also successful, but was very much longer.
I think that one of the difference, I'll come back to that later at the end of the discussion, but I think one of the main difference is obviously the culture of the big companies versus the small ones, and the skills and culture of the people. I'm not talking about national culture, but more about professional culture and how they behave internally in big or small companies. And one of the important point is also stakeholder decision making, and especially for what concerns project funding. So basically, at least in my experience, you've got like project funding in big pharma, which are driven internally quite a lot, with a lot of stakeholders, which are putting their pressure on the decision, while in smaller companies, in startup, the pressure is also there, but it comes from external investors, and they are investors. So I mean, they've got a stake in the company, obviously, but they don't live the day-to-day life in the company. So first of all, would you agree that there is really this difference in terms of pressure between both type of stakeholders, and does it correlate in your experience with the way business cases are built and decisions are taken?
Maybe I start. I think I would agree, definitely. I think, what I saw a lot of in pharma is, you need to build the business case almost from an internal competition perspective, because you're part of a portfolio then of 100 plus programs, all competing for a defined pot of resource and a defined pot of budget as well. And big pharma puts a lot of effort into prioritizing its internal programs, based on ROI, based on strategic alignment, based on probability of success, etc. And there was a lot of governance energy put into managing those priorities, and it was done very ruthlessly as well. So whereas, like you say, Eric, I think in smaller companies then you have much more of an external focus, and I think it's also, you see the differences as well in when big pharma starts to develop a product, the end point is always with a view to commercializing that, either by itself or in partnership. So it's a full end-to-end development program envisaged, whereas with smaller companies, then that they may have ultimately a different goal. It could be getting to some inflection point in terms of value, or generating data to then go out and kind of sell the asset. So I see some real fundamental differences in the way that those business cases are constructed, big pharma versus small company.
Yes, there's definitely a big difference. And what I appreciate here with big pharma, because as you said, it's more an internal competition. Usually the pipeline is so rich that you also have the philosophy of kill early because if it's not delivering according to the envisioned target product profile, it's better you stop a program and put your resources on the next one. And I think this is also a fundamental difference towards the startups or very small companies that usually maybe have only a handful. And even if you have a handful, usually in my experience, you have a front runner and the others are later. So the question is then really towards the investors, how do you build this business case? And I mean, what I appreciate with Big Pharma is that if you do it right, you have these review rounds where also you try to really ensure that you compare apples to apples, that there's not that much of opinion, but really you have all the external benchmark, you have the money to buy those reports, to really have other sources, as many as possible, to make it as objective as possible. Whereas in smaller companies, in my experience, there's also a lot of opinion, and that requires when you later on, come to the next phase, and it turns out, oh, maybe it's more, much more expensive, right? Because you did not have the money to buy those benchmarking reports earlier on, or it takes way longer. That's also my experience that I felt in Big Pharma. That's really an advantage in portfolio management. You have access to so many sources that you can make it very well prepared. Whereas in small pharma, you simply don't have access, or you don't have the money to get all this access to the multiple sources. That's why there's way more risk. And while it's good operationally sometimes to take more risk in the business cases, it could fall back on your feet when you find out these things, that maybe it takes longer or is more expensive.
No, it brings up you bring up a very good point too of the opinion that's involved. Again, I'm finding myself kind of in the middle here, where not exactly startup, not fully dependent on investor or angel money, but instead being fully self-sufficient, but not so self-sufficient that you can do everything you want. And in that kind of middle space, there's still very much a challenge of, we have to have a limited portfolio. So which are the ones that are going to be the front runners? And the challenge that there is between being fully committed to one, for however long that ends up being, versus taking a more diversified approach, which inevitably means going slower with each of them. And I find myself at times being a little frustrated, almost with the desire to be more committed to one, even for a time, and like Ulrike has mentioned, fail fast, right, or come to a no decision more quickly, rather than kind of carrying a burden of several, but not being able to make the progress that's needed to even get to a decision.
Well, thank you very much, all. I agree with everything that was said. I just would like to highlight one of the point that was made by Paul about decision making, influence, which are more competitive driven or internal competition driven in big companies, and inflection point driven in startups. And that's something I've been pushing some of my clients in some work we have been doing in really looking at portfolios or portfolio of indication in the framework of thinking about value inflection points for the company. Because at the end of the day, the customer is really, to a certain extent, the investors, and they want to see the inflection point. So I think this is really the major difference, the short-term value inflection point in the company, where you can create the most value for the company on a relatively short term, because then you increase the probability of next round of funding or the next round of partnering. So basically, to me, that's the main difference I see between big and small companies. Of course, big companies are aiming at creating value, but they don't see it the same way as small companies driven by investors, really trying to create significant investment inflection point within the next year or a couple of years. Well, especially in medtech, where it's relatively short, it can be a bit longer in pharma or in biotech. But in my experience, at least, that's the main difference between those.
Yes, you're right. It's actually, of course, Big Pharma wants to commercialize. That's why they have, I think also the perspective is much longer term. We also did the always did the business case towards launch, and in the newer times, of course, also have a lot of focus on market access reimbursement, right, which is then the fourth hurdle. Whereas in smaller companies, if you want to sell it, it's usually either, depending if you have markers after phase 1 or 1/2, or in my experience, latest after phase 2, where you have the best return versus risk before you start the big phase 3s. Then, of course, you do not really, these are usually the gaps. You don't really plan early on for these time and money consuming activities that you then leave to big pharma, right? So there is definitely differences.
Oh, we've got a question from Mike. How much has your big pharma Rolodex of contact been of value in your small company versus your know-how and collective experience? Anybody wants to build on that?
Maybe I start. I think it's. I think the latter has been more important for me than the list of contacts. I think the reason for that is I find myself in a small pharma dealing with a different set of vendors, a different set of customers, etc. So, all of those previous contacts, they're useful to some extent, but I find I'm not dealing with them so much day to day. I find it's actually more useful for me taking the lessons learned and thinking about what good looks like in a pharma setting and trying to apply that on a smaller scale and with more flexibility in a biotech or a smaller pharma personally.
So thank you, Paul. I hope, Mike, it answers your question. I just would like to conclude because we are really aiming toward the end. I mean, we have been talking about the differences, and we see a number of people moving from one to the other. Actually, we see more people moving from big company to small companies than the other way around. Given the short amount of time that remains, my question to you would be, what advice would you give to any senior executive who has been like a big guy in a big pharma moving to a startup or a smaller companies? What would be the main advice you would give to these people moving in terms of how they need to acclimate to the new company, or what are the skills they need to have, or whatever? I mean, if you've got like one VP moving to becoming a CTO or a CSO in a biotech, what is the main advice you guys would be giving them?
I think they should really be open to participate in the work hands-on and do whatever is needed, instead of expecting, like in big pharma, where you have these clear roles, responsibilities, that you really have a team that does everything and comes with a nice reports and comes to the steering committee, where you just, if you are senior VP in big pharma, you probably just need to delegate and decide, right? You take decisions. And in smaller companies, you really are expected to contribute much more. So if you don't have a hands-on mentality, you probably will not be happy.
Yeah, I would build on that and say, don't forget all the best practices that you've picked up in big pharma, because it's a fantastic training ground, but be prepared to flex them, because the big pharma model may not be appropriate.
Yeah. And the key piece of, before making that move, know yourself and know what type of environment you really thrive in, and be willing, as both colleagues have said, to be able to shift your approach.
Okay. Yeah, I definitely agree with what you all said. I think we are getting close to the end now, so I would like to thank you all very much for the nice discussion. Interesting to see that there is a high level of alignment between us, so I hope it was useful to the floor. Peter, I give you back the speech. Again, thank you very much to the audience. Thank you very much to my fellow panelists. Much appreciated your contribution. And maybe we'll get a chance to meet physically next year.
Thank
That
you
would
all.
be great. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.
See you in France
Bye-bye.
then.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Paul, Kyle, Ulrike, and Eric.
You're welcome.
You're welcome.